All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Indonesia's decision to join BRICS. We're not just going to cover like the basic news, that already happened. We're going to try to figure out what it all means.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got some great sources for this. Like we've been reading analysis from Indonesian experts, economists, political scientists. Plus, we'll look at some reactions from folks around the world, get a sense of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And the big question here, right? Is this a smart move for Indonesia or a risky one? Because on the one hand, you've got the potential for access to all these new
It's
markets.
huge potential, yeah.
But on the other hand, is it going to damage their relationship with the West? So it's kind of this tightrope walk they're doing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. So first things first, just a really quick reminder for anyone who needs it. BRICS originally was Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
The OG5.
Exactly. But now it's expanded to 10 nations, with Indonesia as, the latest addition. And one thing that's important to note, right off the bat, Indonesia, this is a big deal, right? I mean, it's the largest economy in Southeast Asia, fourth most populous nation in the world.
Exactly. This isn't some small country making a minor decision. This has the potential to, really shift things global.
For sure. And we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? Some people see BRICS as this counter to Western power, especially with China and Russia at the table.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the narrative.
So how are people feeling about this in Indonesia?
Well, it's interesting because there's actually a pretty heated debate going on. Like, some experts are really skeptical about this whole thing.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. For example, there's this guy, Vincencio Dutis. He's from the University of Erlangen.
Okay.
And he doesn't really see any clear economic benefits, and he's worried about a backlash from Western countries.
So not everyone's celebrating in the streets about this.
No, definitely not. There are real concerns. Like, Dugas specifically talks about Western investors getting hesitant, pulling back, which could obviously hurt Indonesia's economy in the long run.
Right, that makes sense.
And then you've got Muhammad Andri Perdana from the Bright Institute. And he thinks that this whole BRICS thing could, push Indonesia further away from the OECD nations.
Which are, just for people who don't know.
Yeah, so those are mostly, the wealthy, developed countries, like the U.S. and Europe.
Got it.
And Perdana's worried that, Indonesia could end up being kind of a hostage in these global power struggles. That's the word he uses.
Wow. Yeah, that's a strong image.
Yeah, it definitely paints a stark picture.
So it sounds like there's some serious anxiety over there.
Oh yeah, and it's not just those two guys. We also read this piece by Gallo D. Muhammad from Celios. And he basically argues that Indonesia needs to have a very clear domestic agenda within BRICS. What do they want to get out of this? Otherwise, he's worried it'll just be a lot of hype and excitement that doesn't actually lead to anything concrete.
So we've got this chorus of skeptics, but I'm guessing there's another side to this.
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of experts who are super optimistic about joining BRICS.
What are they seeing that the other folks aren't?
Well, one perspective comes from Budisattrio Jiwandono. He's from the Gerindra Party. And he emphasizes that Indonesia has always had this free and active foreign policy.
Okay.
Meaning they don't want to be forced to choose sides, they want to work with everyone. And he sees BRICS as more about collaboration than confrontation. He even points out that Indonesia is already part of a bunch of international groups like APEC, the G20, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So
it's not like they're suddenly turning their backs on the West or anything?
Right, exactly. They're just adding another partner to the mix.
Okay, that's a good point.
And then you've got someone like Bagasus Mujadi from Griffith University. He's really excited about the potential for expanding access to, non-traditional markets.
That's interesting. But Indonesia already has pretty strong ties with China and India, right? And they're both already part of BRICS. So what's the extra benefit here for the optimists?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems like for them, it's about more than just those existing relationships. They see it as a chance to diversify their economic partnerships even further, like tapping into the growing economic power of BRICS as a whole, not just individual members.
Okay, but before we get too deep into that, there's this thing that's been bugging me, and I gotta bring it up. What about that whole thing with, a certain former U.S. president? The one who threatened to put a 100% tariff on all BRICS nations if he gets reelected.
Oh, right, yeah.
Wouldn't that basically wipe out any gains that Indonesia might be hoping for?
It's a very valid concern. If those tariffs actually happened, it would definitely impact Indonesian exports. So it's this weird balance, right? The optimists are excited about new markets and growth, but the skeptics have some really solid points about the potential downsides and risks.
Yeah, it's a tough call for sure. So we've got this like internal debate happening in Indonesia, but what about the rest of the world? How are people reacting to this outside of Indonesia?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because despite how big this is, a major Southeast Asian nation aligning itself with a bloc that's seen as a potential rival to Western power, the Western media has been pretty quiet about it.
Really? You'd think this would be front page news everywhere.
You would, but it's been surprisingly muted.
Huh, why do you think that is?
Well, one economist, Philip Pilkington, he had a pretty interesting take. He basically argued that the West might be missing a major shift in global power dynamics. Like, they're just not paying attention to the rise of BRICS.
So maybe the West is a little bit in denial?
Possibly. Or maybe it's more deliberate, like if you don't acknowledge the problem, maybe you don't have to deal with it.
Oh yeah, I know that strategy well.
But the problem is, ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. And in this case, it could actually be dangerous for the West. If they don't engage with these emerging powers, they risk becoming isolated and losing their influence.
So they need to like wake up and smell the coffee.
Exactly. The world is changing, and they need to adapt if they want to stay relevant.
Okay, so maybe the West is missing the bigger picture, but what is that bigger picture? Like what's happening with BRICS that's so significant?
Well, there's this history professor from Oxford, and he lays out some pretty eye-opening statistics. He points out that the BRICS nations now account for about 40% of the global economy. When you measure it by purchasing power parity, that is...
Okay, hold on. For those of us who aren't economists, what exactly is purchasing power parity?
It's basically a way of comparing economies that takes into account the cost of living in different countries. So it gives you a more accurate picture of how much people can actually buy with their money, in different parts of the world.
Right. That makes sense. So 40% of the global economy by that measure, that's huge.
It is. And it gets even bigger when you factor in the partner nations that are aligning themselves with BRICS. That number jumps to almost 45%. To put that into perspective, the BRICS economy, plus its partners, is now larger than the G7 was just a decade ago.
Wow, that's pretty crazy to think about. So this BRICS expansion, it's not just symbolic, it has some serious economic weight behind it.
Exactly. And while the professor cautioned against, overblowing the hype and acknowledged that there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what BRICS actually is, he was very clear in saying that a new world is forming and we can't ignore it.
It's like we're watching the tectonic plates of global power shifting right before our eyes. Okay, so for you, the listener, why should you care about Indonesia joining BRICS? What's the big takeaway here?
I think the key takeaway is that BRICS is gaining power on the world stage, and Indonesia is making a calculated but potentially risky move to be part of that.
And this isn't just about Indonesia, right? This could have ripple effects across the whole world, in terms of trade, geopolitics, even how we think about power in general.
Absolutely. And it raises some big questions about whether this will lead to more cooperation and development or just further divide the world into competing blocs.
Which is a question we're going to unpack more in the rest of this deep dive, so stick with us.
It's important to remember, BRICS itself, it's not like a single thing.
Yeah, they've got all sorts of different political systems and economic priorities.
Exactly. And their views on global issues, they can be totally different. Just because they're in the same economic bloc doesn't mean they're going to agree on everything.
Right. So Indonesia might actually find allies within BRICS to kind of balance out China's influence, which just adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, that diversity within BRICS, it could be a strength. It allows for more nuance, but it could also cause friction. It could lead to disagreements that weaken the whole bloc.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how Indonesia plays that, Will they try to be the mediator? Will they side more with some members than others?
Great questions. Definitely something to keep an eye on as things develop. Okay, so let's shift gears for a second, talk about the economic stuff. What are some of the specific benefits Indonesia might be hoping to get out of BRICS membership?
Well, we heard from that one guy, Bagas Ismajadi, right? He was talking about how important it is to get access to those non-traditional markets.
Right, like diversifying their economic portfolio, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Not putting all their eggs in one basket, especially with all the, global economic uncertainty we're seeing.
And BRICS membership could open doors to new trade partnerships, new investment opportunities.
Okay, so less reliance on the West, more opportunities in emerging economies. Makes sense given their existing ties with China and India. But of course, there's the flip side too, like we talked about. The potential for backlash from the West, those tariffs, the risk of getting caught in the middle of geopolitical rivalries.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act for sure.
They want to stay independent, but also grab these new opportunities.
And that's where that whole free and active foreign policy comes in, right?
Refresh my memory on that one.
Basically, it means Indonesia has always tried to avoid picking sides in these big power struggles. They'd rather just work with everyone.
Which has worked out pretty well for them so far. But some people, like Pradana, they argue that joining BRICS might make that harder.
Yeah, he's worried that Indonesia might have already kind of leaned towards China with those concessions in the South China Sea, you remember?
Right.
And that could definitely strain their relations with other countries, both in the region and in the West.
It's like Indonesia just made a really bold move in this giant game of chess.
That's a great analogy.
What do you think their end game is? What are they trying to achieve here?
It's tough to say for sure, but it seems like they want to be a major player in this, multipolar world. They want a seat at the table when decisions are being made about the global economy, international relations, all of that.
Okay, so big ambitions, but is joining BRICS the best way to get there?
That's the million-dollar question. We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. But speaking of the bigger picture, let's zoom out for a second and think about the wider implications of all this, Remember those stats about BRICS, the economic power?
Yeah, 40% of the global economy by purchasing power parity and like 45% if you include the partner nations.
Exactly. And adding Indonesia to that mix just makes it even more significant. It's a clear sign that the balance of power is shifting. Emerging economies are claiming a bigger and bigger share.
It's like watching a slow-motion earthquake reshaping the whole global power structure.
And like any earthquake, there are going to be aftershocks. This shift could reshape everything from trade to international institutions. We might even see a push to reform things like the World Bank and the IMF to better reflect this new reality.
Okay, so lots of potential changes on the horizon, but what should we be watching for specifically in the coming months and years? Like, what are the signs that this BRICS expansion is really reshaping things?
Well, one thing to watch is how BRICS functions as a group now with all these new members. Can they stay united? Can they agree on a common agenda? Or will internal divisions and competing interests hold them back?
Yeah, because a divided BRICS isn't going to be nearly as influential as a united one. And what about the reaction from the West? How are the US and Europe going to adapt to this new landscape?
Another great question. Will they try to counter BRICS' influence? Or will they be willing to cooperate and find ways to work together on things like climate change and poverty?
And what about the possibility of increased competition between BRICS and the West, especially in areas like trade, tech, and military influence?
That's definitely a risk. And it could lead to more tension, maybe even conflict. It's a really complex situation. Too early to say how it'll all shake out.
But one thing's for sure. Indonesia's decision to join BRICS has added a whole new level of uncertainty to the global scene. It's like we're watching this real-time experiment in global power dynamics unfold, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah,
it's a wild time to be watching global politics, that's for sure. Feels like we're throwing out the old playbook.
It really does. And I think that uncertainty, it can be kind of scary for some people, but it can also lead to new ideas, new ways of thinking about the world.
Totally. So let's go back to that uncertainty for a sec, especially how the rest is reacting to all this. We talked earlier about how the Western media has been kind of quiet about Indonesia joining BRICS. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a few theories floating around out there. Some experts think that maybe the West is just underestimating how important this all is. Like they're reluctant to let go of their old ideas about global power,
So like they're clinging to an outdated map.
Exactly. Or it could be more deliberate. Maybe they're choosing to downplay the rise of BRICS. Because if you don't acknowledge it, maybe you don't have to deal with it.
Right. The old, if I ignore it, it'll go away strategy.
Right. But the problem is, ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. And in this case, it could actually be a pretty bad move for the West. If they don't engage with these emerging powers, they could end up isolated and lose their global influence.
So they got to adapt to the new reality.
Exactly. Remember, the world is becoming more and more multipolar. It's not just East versus West anymore. New alliances are popping up, new centers of power all over the place.
And Indonesia joining BRICS is a perfect example of that. Shows how the old dividing lines are getting blurry.
For sure. And it really highlights the need for new ways of understanding global politics and economics. We need new frameworks for this new, more complex world.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Indonesia and BRICS, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay, sure.
Will BRICS ultimately be a force for good in the world? Will it help create a more level playing field, more cooperation, more prosperity? Or will it just lead to more division, more conflict?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
Nope. But one thing is for sure. We're living in a time of massive change, and decisions like Indonesia joining BRICS are shaping the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So stay curious, keep asking questions, and we'll keep bringing you these deep dives into the biggest issues facing the world. And as always, we love hearing from you, so please share your thoughts with us. Thanks for tuning in.